The San Diego Padres start off things in Miami on the right foot, winning by a score of 9-4. Wow, 9 runs. Pretty cool. Recapping last night's game with an offensive explosion due to a broadcast blackout, the debut of Mr. Gary Sanchez for the Padres, and overall making the case for how this team can turn things around. What needs to go right going forward? You know what you're listening to, guys, so let's get started.
You are Locked On Padres, your daily San Diego Padres podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Padres podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day for Wednesday, the last day of May, as in the 31st. As always, I'm your host with sometimes, occasionally, but certainly not always the most, Javier Reyes. You can follow me on Twitter at Javipeno, Javiipeno, or at LO_Padres. If you don't like my tweets about whatever the heck I do on my personal account, then don't worry. I usually live tweet the games and whatnot on Locked On Padres. Didn't as much the past couple days as I was very, very sick. I'm still a little sick, but I'm feeling mostly better. And that's why we're doing this show. So this isn't quite a flu game episode for me, but it's, you know, we're hanging in there. We're hanging in there, folks, because we had some cool stuff happen for the Padres last night. And of course, go subscribe to the YouTube as well, because you might want to see the new layout and just my goofy little hat and my friends here on the the video feed with Pac-Man and Tatis, if that's your thing. Thank you for making Locked On Padres your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, and also this episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook partner of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. And for today's episode, we are getting started by talking about last night's game against the Padres, between the Padres and the Marlins, a team that has been excelling in some ways this year. I think Luis Arias is like a player for the Marlins that's very scary as a Padres fan to go against, because he is just a batting average on base machine. And then they've got Jorge Soler, who's been absolutely crazy and whatnot. And we're going to break down from the Marlins perspective on Thursday's show, when Peter Pratt of Locked On Marlins comes on to do a little bit of a series recap. But for today's episode, what I wanted to do is talk about the first game and then take some time to discuss what exactly are my thoughts on the Padres going forward, trying to be a little bit more positive and at least just talk about what it might take, what are some aspects of the team that I think need to get better, and what is the case to be made for them being a playoff team and potentially a World Series contender, as was promised and expected from the team before the season and all this madness and jokerism started. But first, here we go. Let's start with the basics, ladies and gentlemen. They win last night's game 9-4. Ryan Weathers, not necessarily the reason why. 4 innings, 3 earned runs on 7 hits. He walked 3, struck out 4. He actually had a couple nice whiffs on his changeup, which I like to see last night, which is cool. 5 in total among the pitches that he threw. Not bad, not terrible. Ryan Weathers is literally the epitome of a 5-starter. 4.28 ERA on the season, 1.37 whip. He is just a 5-starter. He's slowly starting to look the way that he did at the second half of 2021, which is that people are making harder contact against him. And it's funny, though, because he didn't totally break. There was a moment in this game when the Marlins, had bases loaded with nobody out. And they end up not really getting that many runs across, which was great. And it needs to be emphasized why that's great, because I was nervous. I thought it was over. I tweeted out, "We are so cooked, man." And maybe that was the sickness talking. I admit. Maybe that was the sickness talking. But the reverse jinx worked. They were able to ground into, what's the word? They were able to procure a double play. They were able to manage a double play. I'm not exactly sure what it is. But Garrett Cooper for the Marlins gets a single, but then Gene Segura flies out. So thankfully, not too much for the Marlins in that kind of situation, which was great because I thought they might blow the game wide open. And Weather's only going 4 innings and allowing 3 seems like a doom situation, especially when you consider that Domingo Tapia wasn't great in this game either. He walks 3 and only lets up 1 earned run. So the Marlins pulled the Padres last night with runners in scoring position, something they haven't been great by. In fact, they actually lead the league, I believe, in double plays by a decent margin, which is kind of crazy. So, if there's ever been a team that could potentially do worse with runners in scoring position, the Marlins might be on the short list for that. And they showed it last night, thankfully for the Padres' sake. But bullpen, thankfully, was able to be pretty solid for the rest of the game, giving up no earned runs and only 2 walks and 3 hits amongst them. So kind of like a full starting pitcher's day from the bullpen with Tim Hill, Steven Wilson, who's quietly been back to what he was at the beginning of the season before he got lit up in Mexico, Nick Martinez, and Brent Honeywell. Brent Honeywell being the player that I really have talked about this before. I've rooted for so much this season to see him be at least a productive major league player with all that he's been through. So shouts to him and shouts to the Padres offense in this game. And oh man. At one point during this game, somewhat coincidentally and conveniently or whatever, like the very Shakespearean timing, some might say, after it was announced that Diamond Sports did not make a bid for the broadcast rights for the Padres, and it's going to be reverting to apparently MLB control. I don't think anyone who has the MLB subscriptions that this is going to be affected by you. I just don't know if it'll be a Bally Sports production necessarily anymore. I don't know. Whole weird thing. And then, of course, last night there was an electrical outage. And what happened? It happened for the Marlins broadcast too, so this wasn't just for the Padres, but there was no like graphics and whatnot, any of that. And then for the Padres broadcast, there was no Don or Mud for the longest time. And in that inning, when we got nothing from those guys, the Padres offense explodes, ladies and gentlemen. Fernando Tatis Jr. and Juan Soto have big games today, or I should say big games, but some nice games as well. 1 for 4 with Tatis. He does get an RBI and a walk and a stolen base. Juan Soto, who actually is intentionally walked, he's just been, I mean, seriously, this is a MVP caliber player that has been playing like it for more than a month now. He looks excellent. 2 for 3 in this game with 2 RBIs, an intentional walk, 2 normal walks, and even threw a stolen base in there. The Padres end up having like their best runners in scoring position moment in a long time. I actually read that it was like the first time they had hit with runners in scoring position like this month, or maybe the second time in this month with the bases loaded and nobody out. Something like, I forgot what the stat was, but bottom line, it was very rare appearance by the Padres offense, and it all happens when there's no Don or Mud to talk about it, which is really funny in a lot of ways. So it makes me wonder whether or not, perhaps, is this the turnaround? The Diamond Sports Group losing rights. Were they the curse? Were they the curse of the Padres? I don't know. I don't know for sure, but we're going to see. But anyway, they end up putting up a whole bunch of runs in this game. Soto gets an RBI in the top of the 5th, and then in the top of the 7th, you get one from Tatis and Soto, and then later on in the game, a big inning for the Padres to kind of blow the game wide open, getting a single from Xander Bogaerts, who's been mired in a bad slump for a while now, not hitting the ball very hard. Just really anemic offense on his part after starting so well. But he gets an RBI in this one. So does Rougned Odor on a fielder's choice, and then Matt Carpenter has a double. And then Ha-Seong Kim, in what feels like it's been a while, a sacrifice fly. Not a big deal because they're already up 8-4 by them to make it 9-4, but I'm just so used to the Padres striking out and having just the worst productive outs, right? And I think that other fans and commentators made this observation as well, that they just don't put together productive outs. So seeing a Ha-Seong Kim fly out is just kind of cool. I know that sounds such like a small thing, but I really think that that's a big deal, that you come in and are able to deliver on, granted, a small scale, but it's really nice to see. I'm really thrilled about that. So shouts to the Padres offense, man. And especially against Sandy Alcantara, who has been not that great this year, I will say. 4.93 ERA on the season. He hasn't been what he usually is. He's been walking like more than like 3 batters a game. He's not striking out many people, which has never been usually his thing, but 4.93 ERA on the season, having a really bad post-Cy Young season so far, Sandy Alcantara, which has hurt the Marlins tremendously, I think, in a lot of ways. Although he is still a very good pitcher, I think. Padres took advantage of what has been a very disastrous first half for him. He goes 6 1/3, 4 earned runs, walks 5, and only strikes out 3. So not the best for him, and the Padres end up hitting up Dylan Floro the most out of all these guys. So, look, I'll take it. I don't care. The Padres need wins. Let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen. And also last night, the debut of Gary Sanchez at catcher, which I have a lot of thoughts on, ladies and gentlemen. I have a lot of thoughts, and I just want to clarify them just in case people think that I'm being a hater, of too much of a hater. Before we get into that, though, ladies and gentlemen, today's episode, I mentioned to you, is brought by FanDuel. So I got to talk to you a little bit more about FanDuel, ladies and gentlemen. It's time. You got to make a fast break to FanDuel, because you know what's going on right now. The NBA Finals. Well, not right now. Maybe depending on when you're listening to. But they start tomorrow. That's right. NBA Finals, Nuggets Heat. Don't listen to those fools about ratings. The only thing I know is that right now, new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500 at FanDuel. That's pretty cool. That's back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. So if you want to bet on Nikola Jokic to win the MVP, you can do that. He's the favorite by quite a lot. If you want to bet on the Nuggets, they're the favorite by a lot. You could do that. Maybe you want to bet on Caleb Martin of the Miami Heat randomly, just being better than Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. You could do that. You could absolutely do that. You could bet on Jimmy Butler. You could do it. You could bet on Bam Adebayo, whatever you want. Hey, all I'm saying is this. I know the Nuggets are the better team, and honestly, as a hoop fan, I think that this series is awesome, and I don't care about ratings, and the ratings don't care about you. But let me tell you, the Heat have been underdogs in, 4 playoff series? 3, I think, technically, including the Knicks. They beat the Bucks pretty soundly. They canceled the apocalypse by losing to a Boston team almost. That would have been bad. I'm just saying, you're going to get a lot of people this week saying that it's not even close, and I just question whether or not people are literally just watching sports. This has been a concern of mine for a while. I don't know if people are watching sports sometimes when they talk about it, which I know has been a criticism myself. Anyway, I'm getting off track, ladies and gentlemen. There's no better place to bet all the playoff action than America's #1 sportsbook. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sportsbook betting partner of not just Locked On, but the NBA. And we're back, ladies and gentlemen, here on the Locked On Padres podcast. The best podcast ever, man, let me tell you. I am just trying to ram through this episode because I need to go back to bed and get some rest, let me tell you. But before you get back to rest, you got to talk about El Guerre, the Kraken, who made his debut for the Padres last night at catcher. And he goes 1 for 4 with a strikeout, which already felt like the best catching game offensively that the Padres have had in a long time. That's not actually true. Brett Sullivan and even Austin Nola have had a couple hits every now and then. But when this signing was announced, and this plays into my overall vibes on how I feel like the team could bounce back if they do make any sort of bounce back from what has been a nightmare season so far. My issue with the Gary Sanchez signing wasn't Gary Sanchez himself, because when you do consider that Brett Sullivan, not very good, and also just not totally ready, I think, as a defensive player just yet. I don't know if he was ready yet. Although I know that people have been showing around that image of him diving like it's an Indiana Jones reaching for the golden idol or whatever, like just kind of diving across and tagging out the runner in Washington, like showing a lot of effort. And I know people brought that up. Unfortunately, he's the one that gets optioned, not Austin Nola, who might not have any options anymore. That might be why. I'm not totally sure on that. You'd have to double check me. But, you see him get demoted. And just in general, Austin Nola's been terrible. One of the worst qualified catchers in baseball this year. That signing Gary Sanchez really isn't that bad of a move. For me, why I compared it on Twitter to Robinson Cano, when the Padres brought him in last year, it really has nothing to do with Gary Sanchez. It's more, here's an old veteran that basically on every other competitive playoff, serious organization type of team, they've passed on, right? You saw the Mets passed on him last week, that they demoted him. Granted, the Mets have a very, very good and very talented young catcher in Francisco Alvarez, who's been awesome level prospect. But even still, most teams have kind of passed on this guy. The Yankees got infinitely better without him. And as someone who lives in the tri-state area, I can attest to all the sports talk radio segments that love to blame Gary Sanchez for everything for why the Yankees weren't good. As evidenced by the Yankees' performance in the playoffs, though, clearly not all on Gary Sanchez. That team is they just choke like dogs every year, right? Kind of like the Dodgers of the American League in some sense. But Gary Sanchez, he can still hit for a catcher by catcher standards. Someone tweeted at me, Baseball Savant, which is occasionally what's it called? A pet peeve of mine when people just like tweeting the kind of whatever that's called, the StatCast profile. But in 2022, not the worst stuff ever. He's max exit velocity, 97th percentile, average exit velocity, 78th, hard hit percent, it's 92%, which I really liked. But not a big batting average guy, and certainly a guy who strikes out way too much and whiffs at too many pitches. Again, not terrible when you take into account that it's catcher offense, right? For catcher offense, this is a guy that if you gave him kind of enough at bats, he could probably get you something like 20 home runs, something like that, which is pretty decent. In 2022, he hit 16 for the Twins. Unfortunately, he was also slashing pretty horribly, 205, 282 with 377 on base. But he's had good years before. He's not super old yet, so I get it. I get them being and looking at Austin Noel, who I think has maybe one hard hit ball all year, and saying it's worth a shot. I don't blame that way of thinking. For me, I compared it to Robinson Cano, and it's both Dominican Republic players, but more so it is a sign of how desperate the Padres are that they have to bring in Gary Sanchez, and that's usually not a good sign. And I understand that last year the team was able to make the playoffs, but it just screams to me desperation. In fairness, though, the Padres are desperate, and they should be. In order for the Padres to match the record that they have last year, they would have to go 64-44 the rest of the way. Not an unachievable thing. And you're going to get a lot of people over the next couple weeks who talk about the Padres saying, hey, well, I mean, remember when the 2018 Nationals, you remember that? Or 2019? Was it 2019? 2019 Nationals, oh, they started off 25-31 or whatever it is, and then they ended up winning the World Series. You're going to get a lot of that. I think it's a mistake to look at teams that were an anomaly, that were pretty anomalous, as a supporting argument for your team being better and not giving up. I think that could be a little bit dangerous because, like a lot of teams for what I just talked about, the NBA, a lot of teams are going to try and replicate and say, hey, they're the 8th seed, who cares? We should go for it and try and, make it to the finals, even though it's more of an isolated incident with the Heat. Same thing for, I think, that Nationals team. I think that the Pods are in a really precarious situation where I don't know what they can do. And I think that that's the big problem with this team, is that every single player is locked up. And even if they wanted to reset and say, you know what, this isn't our year, we should just like blow things up for a little bit, keep some of our star players for sure, but trade some of the ones that we don't need, and then say, all right, let's reset next year, go back to it, try and get some players in free agency, maybe enter the Ohtani sweepstakes. But they can't quite do that because most of the big players on this team are extended, with Tatis, who they would never trade anyway, with Manny Machado, with Jake Cronenworth, who is a player that went 0 for 6 last night, by the way, with 3 strikeouts, hitting .209 on the season. Cronenworth just does not look like he's going to be able to do what he did years ago, right? That's what I'm worried about. Those first 2 years were magical, and I just don't think he can do it. I think that this is just who he is, which is a solid baseball player and not much more. I'm really worried about it. But they extended him for another 8 years. They gave Bogaerts the 11-year deal. They gave Yu Darvish an extension, and he got lit up against the Yankees, as you saw on Sunday. They extended Joe Musgrove. I think that a lot of the players that might have value, maybe like a Yu Darvish, there's just no obvious player to trade. The only obvious player to trade that would get you a whole bunch of prospects back is Juan Soto. And you don't want to do that because he's been phenomenal and a borderline MVP, and also because you gave up your entire future for him. One of the weirdest things about this whole Soto situation is that if you gave up your entire future for him and you didn't work out an extension, but you were okay with extending Machado, Cronenworth, and Darvish and giving Bogaerts a contract this offseason, it's just weird. It speaks to me as you you didn't quite think this through. Now, again, this episode is mostly about me talking about what is the case for the Padres to bounce back. So let's talk about that. Number one, I think that, the 64-44 record, in order to match last year, it should be emphasized that because of the extra wild card rule, that they don't need to necessarily win the division, right? This is not a team that needs to win the division. They just kind of need to be better than Arizona or something along that line, right? They need to be able to be better than some of those teams currently in the National League wild card standings. If I could check that out right now, really quickly on my telephone device, they're a half game back out of a wild card spot. Not that bad. Currently in the NL wild card are teams that I don't think that these are teams, except for maybe Arizona, that are teams that would really freak you out and be like, yeah, we definitely are definitively worse than them. I think they're worse than the Dodgers, Braves, and maybe even the Brewers to an extent. But the San Francisco Giants have been playing well this year, which I warned about before the season. I thought that team made some nice adjustments. And my favorite free agent, Michael Conforto, has been balling lately. And then the Miami Marlins, who they're currently playing right now. So by the end of this series, it's not impossible that if the Padres sweep this thing, that they'll be in a wild card spot, which is hilarious and funny to imagine. Or, oh, I'm sorry, they're not a half game back. I was reading Pittsburgh. They're 2.5 games back. So never mind that. They'd have to probably sweep this series and then win a game after that, and the Marlins would have to keep losing. It's the Pirates that are a half game back, so I can't read. I think that you have to, again, with the extra wild card, it needs to be emphasized that they do not have to win the division. They don't have to become second in the division, so that's important to remember. The next thing is that the Padres have been so abominable with runners in scoring position this year. Historically bad in a lot of ways. I don't want to say historically, actually, because I don't know if there's been worse teams before. But in terms of expectations and in terms of what is on the roster, pretty horrendous. If they were to just be an average team the rest of the way, that could be huge and could launch a win streak with how this team's starting pitching looks and with how this team's bullpen has been looking and with how this closer situation has been looking and overall how its defense has been looking. The other side of the ball has been fine for the most part for the Padres. We've talked about Mr. Michael Wacha before and how he's been really stepping up for the team this year. But no one on the Padres offense, aside from Juan Soto and maybe a little bit of Tatis, has done the same. So they just need to step up a little bit in offense and just be a little bit better. And I think that another thing they have to be better in is the catching situation. Luis Campusano, the Campusano hive that I tried to start earlier this season is probably dead with the signing of Gary Sanchez, which is fine in a lot of ways. Literally, the last news update that I got was that he'd been catching, like he's been taking pitching practice, and that was like a month ago. So Luis Campusano is just hurt, maybe permanently, and I don't know what's going to happen. I thought he was a wild card for this team, and I think that while it is fair to bring up that his framing metrics, especially according to Baseball Reference, ranked among the worst of all qualified catchers, I thought the assumption that some prognosticators were making that because of that, with a player who has not had consistent sample size of playing, who has not, had consistent playing time overall, and consistently taking backseat days to Austin Nola to start the season, and is a young player who's not been in the major leagues for too long, I think that this is where analytics can get a little bit out of control, where it's like, so for sure that at the end of the year, Austin Nola will finish with 0.2 F4, and then Luis Campusano, if he played more, he would finish with -2 F4. I just think that that's a huge assumption to make for such a young player who has not played all that much. That's just me. I could be wrong, but, whatever. So I think that's done. But if the Padres can get literally anything out of catcher, if they need Austin Nola as a catcher for certain pitchers to start in order to frame a little bit better, whatever. If Gary Sanchez can revert at all to what he was in those early days with the Yankees, not even the early days, but even the post-early days with the Yankees where he hits for a modicum of power, that'd be great. I would appreciate that. The other thing that the Padres have to do is they need to have some sort of roster change among one of these players. I don't know how long the Rougned Odor thing is going to last. I would wager not very long. I do not know how much longer this sort of weird DH situation is going to last, right? With Matt Carpenter and Nelson Cruz both being pretty poor, especially the case of Nelson Cruz, for the last month. Carpenter did hit a double last night, but again, he just seems like a guy that against actually really capable pitchers is going to struggle when they throw him really hard stuff, and he can only kind of hit those off-speed sort of, curveballs and whatnot, which isn't great. He's old. It's fine. I'm not hating on the guy. I think it was a long shot to begin with that he was going to be able to replicate what he did with the Yankees. It was more than a long shot. It was a pipe dream. But for him not to even be able to be an average offensive player is a huge, huge, huge blow for the Padres. So potentially, if the Padres can improve that area in some way, improve the DH, there's plenty of players that you can look at the deadline that potentially could come in and usurp the DH role and be solid for the Padres. For sure. That would not shock me. I think that could very well happen, and I think that there are many signs and many players that could go out there you could get. You could also get, if you want to improve at catcher, maybe if you could ever convince the Royals to rebuild for once and trade away Salvador Perez, that's an option. He could be very good. He has power like crazy. And then also there's Yasmani Grandal, who's a batting average on base guy. I think Salvador Perez is a little bit better as a player, but even still, you never know, right? Like, I think that Yasmani Grandal might not cost as much, and you might be able to fleece the White Sox. Yet again, we fleeced them once before, so maybe we could do it again. Some other players that need to step up. Xander Bogaerts, 111 WRC plus is not bad, but considering he was around like a 126 because of his literally like MVP quality performance to start the year, he's been pretty miserable. 256, 346, 397 slugging so far this year. He's been bad, and unfortunately he is proving the Red Sox fans right that were really weird and kind of like totally okay with Chaim Bloom just giving up on the guy, just saying, never mind, we don't want him. 11 years was a big overpay for sure in terms of years. I don't really care about the money amount. That was an overpay by the Padres, but for this to be bad the first year is really unfortunate considering how bad the team is. Talked about the preseason that, he won't be the first player that struggled from going from the American League to the National League, especially among shortstops. Francisco Lindor of the New York Mets being the obvious example from 2 years ago. But he's looked terrible at the plate. He is not swinging at same pitches outside the zone, not making contact, and his swing just looks rough. This isn't true, but it looks like he almost gives up halfway through his swing. Like the contact, the hard hit stuff is it's just not there. I don't see it for Xander Bogaerts. So he needs to bounce back and have a pretty good second half, or at least just be good offensively, right? That's all you need. But his exit velocity, his hard hit rate, expected slugging, and expected batting average. This is not a guy who is getting BABIP'd to oblivion. And the only thing that's probably helping his F4 stay so solid this year at a 2 wins above replacement has been his defense, which seems like, based on one of my issues with the signing, was wondering, had his best defensive year in a contract year, that might have been a warning sign. Instead, no, it looks like he has been good there. So the defense has been carrying his production. The defense for the Padres in general has been great, but Xander Bogaerts needs to be better, and I don't know exactly how you fix that. Next player is Fernando Tatis Jr., who I wrote about, by the way. Anyone who wants to check it out, wrote a little bit about him becoming a supervillain for justbaseball.com. Go check that out. It should be up by the time you watch this episode. Tatis, I hate that he's in a position right now where he needs to perform like an MVP. I hate it. I hate that we have to go out here and expect Tatis to be incredible. His first year back from surgery and suspension, not playing the entirety of 2022. I hate that he needs to be better. 108 WRC plus. He has been incredible defensively, which has kept his F4 total so high at 1.2. That's a big reason for it. He's had timely home runs. I think overall, his isolated power is 219, which is really, really high. Second highest, or one of the highest marks on the team. If I'm not mistaken. Yeah, it looks like it's the second best mark on the team, which is pretty wild. And then Rougned Odor is the third, by the way, which is not a good sign. My Lord. Oh my gosh, this team, man, this team. But with Tatis, I will say he's looked really impatient at the plate. I think that this is just a timing thing. I think he might be trying to do too much. I think he might be doing what I just said, which is trying to perform like an MVP given the current state of the team. I still think he's actually been more clutch than most players on this team this year. But he needs to be better at not chasing every single pitch outside the zone. It's up by 4% this year. His first strike swing percentage is up, and his whiff rate is up. So he's swinging at every pitch, and he's missing on a good amount of them. When he does make contact, he's been doing what El Nino has done, which is put that ball in the seats, as you saw against those lovely Yankees fans this past weekend. But he needs to be a little bit better at that and needs to take his walks for sure. I think that his time will come, though. 250 BABIP, batting average on balls in play, suggests that he, unlike Xander Bogaerts, has been getting pretty significantly and substantially unlucky with batting average and whatnot. So while, yes, his batting average is currently 247, that's not the best mark in the world. I do think that is a little bit by luck. So I think that maybe within the next week or two, you might see him get around to a 260, maybe 270 mark, low 270 mark, which is good. And then as a result, maybe his on base will be up as well. So I wouldn't be too scared about that. Do not look at the batting average. I think it's going to go up, especially because of the BABIP and his speed. So I think that will get better. But overall, this Padres team, again, 64-44. They need to start winning, and they need to start winning fast. They need to win these division games. They need to beat teams like Miami and San Francisco. They need to make sure the Pirates don't jump in on there. And I think the Mets are going to get better. So for me, when I look at those wild cards, what I see is, and yes, it is annoying that the Milwaukee Brewers, who currently have a run differential of -21, which is actually worse than the Padres. Padres have a -5. It is annoying that the Brewers are just in a terrible division, right? It's good in terms of we don't have to worry about any of their teams being wild card, except for maybe the Pirates a little bit because the Cardinals have been such a disaster. That's the good side, but it does stink that they've basically been worse than the Padres, and in a lot of considerable areas, a lot of measured kind of aspects of playing baseball, but because they're the best in their pretty weak division. Everyone talks about the American League Central. National League Central is even worse, let me tell you, that they're going to be able to make the playoffs just because of that. It stinks. It's a reminder of how crappy baseball can be, because this is a team that never tries and never invests, and they're going to be rewarded because their division stinks. So they don't want to put in the extra mileage, right? But if they can be better than those teams, I think the Mets are eventually going to take one of these wild card spots, probably from the Marlins or the Giants. Don't think the Padres are better than the Mets. I didn't think they were better than the Mets before the season. I think the Mets are going to bounce back, though. And then hopefully if you're better than those other teams, you can still make it. It's not over. It's just been a nightmare circus considering how many possible outcomes for this Padres team were feasible. And they've reached the absolute minimum of their expectations. And basically everybody, with the exception of defense, which was a fear of mine before the year, and starting pitching, which actually hasn't been too bad. They currently stand, in terms of the overall factors on the team, 29th in batting average, 20th on base, 24th in runs scored, 14th in home runs, which is pretty good. But it is, look, again, they just refuse to get hits. They hit a lot of solo shots and nothing else. Slugging percentage 25th. But in terms of a pitching team, it's what's kept them afloat. 10th in earned run average, batting average against their 8th, and whip, they are 10th. Plus the defense, that is what's keeping them alive. But they need to start striking now. And I don't know where they can immediately improve. I haven't talked about Trent Grisham at all, really, because I think that Trent Grisham is what he is. And I don't think that they have a feasible replacement for him. If they were to trade him, I think that there are probably some players out there. Again, if they want to make a play for a catcher, maybe Trent Grisham is what they end up doing. But then the problem is, all right, who do you put in center field? You want to have Jose Azocar there? I wouldn't hate it. I think Jose Azocar and him might be secretly the same player because both of them are pretty capable defensively. And the only difference is that Trent Grisham hits for power, which is big. I get it. But if he's going to strike out 7 times a game and he's going to hit below 200 again, then who cares? You know what I mean? Like, it doesn't, the power is not going to be, you can't be Chris Davis from 2014 or 2015, whatever year it was that he hit below 200. You just can't do it. It's not going to work. I don't know, man. I don't know. If they wanted to make a big trade, they could. But to me, because of the Soto trade, what you see is, got announced yesterday that Ethan Salas, 16 years old, made his pro debut in single A, had a nice double at one point. 16 years old. He's the catcher of the future and might end up being dare I say, like that Adley Rutschman level prospect if he's debuting at this age. Might actually talk with my old buddy Aram Layton about him on a future episode of the pod, so look forward to that. But you really want to trade him? You want to blow up the future for Luis Robert, maybe, out of the Chicago White Sox? I don't know. And it's just, ugh. Fixing this team, there's just pieces you can't move. Can't move Tatis. You might have been able to move Machado if you gave up on this season and said, let's have Machado bounce back a little bit. He comes back off the IL, which another player I didn't talk about is Manny Machado. He needs to hit better. If he comes back off the IL and starts performing better, and you say, you know what, this is a lost season, you might have been able to trade him and recoup and say, all right, we loved you, Manny, but unfortunately we got to move on because the team's been a disaster. But you can't because you extended him. This is the problem. You have nowhere to move. There is no flexibility on this roster. Absent a package that includes Trent Grisham, absent Ha-Seong Kim, absent Juan Soto, which would get you maybe 50% of what you gave up back because he does have an extra year of control. Blake Snell, but I don't think anyone really wants Blake Snell right now. And if they did, you're probably not going to get that much for him because he hasn't been all that great this year. You could argue maybe a team would trade for you, Darvish. Maybe. Just because big name value and all that stuff. Yes, the contract extends him for another bunch of years, but the money per year isn't going to kill a lot of teams. But still, this is the problem with when you extend players, is that it limits your pool. And it's not fair that this is the case, but as a result, when you extend all these players, there's only like 5 or 6 teams in Major League Baseball that are going to make a play for them now that you've given them that much money. If Cronenworth was amazing right now, that's an exception because I know that the 8 years scares people, but since he's not making that much on an average annual value, if he was doing what he had done those first 2 years, then that would be a huge trade chip. But other than that, it takes you out of the market for that stuff. So again, the Padres just need to play average, and I think that the defense and the pitching and the bullpen can carry them to being 64-44. That's not that inachievable for a record for a team that has so much expectations. And once you get into the dance, who cares what happens next? Seriously. I care about what happens next. As I attested to the Juan Soto thing, I don't understand how you trade your entire future for this guy and extend like 7 guys, except not him, right? I don't understand what the thinking was there. But man, it's really tough. It's really tough. And throughout the course of this series and this week, I'll be trying to come up with more cases for what the Padres can do, what other players that they can trade for to kind of make the team not just better, but give them an energizing spark. I hope Machado comes back and is electric. They say that he's close to returning. I hope that Fernando Tatis Jr., that the batting average and he starts catching fire. They need to perform the way they did last night, get more productive outs, and just be better. They just have to be average. Here's how I'll leave it on. The Padres last year were able to just have Manny Machado carry them, have good bullpen, have good starting pitching, great defense, great starting pitching, like I said, with Musgrove and Darvish and Snell leading the way. You add Bogarts, you add Soto, you get Manny back, you add Tatis. If all that comes to, look, they were able to do it with Luke Voit last year, right? Luke Voit was like a guy that we were counting on. Robinson Cano, like I said before. The case to be made is this is not a worse team than last year. So just be average. That's all we're asking for, folks. Just be average. Hit a little bit better with runners in scoring position. That would be lovely. But that about does it today. We've been talking a little bit much, and I need to go back to bed. So with that all being said, that about does it for today's edition of the Locked On Padres podcast, the only pod that may be better than the Padres themselves. Remember to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. Follow me on Twitter at Javipeno, JAVIIPENO, or at LO_Padres. And until next time, stay safe and, of course, stay faithful. My very faithful homies, take care.